Howdy Loxlings. One of my most popular videos of the last few years was my analysis/defense of Bluey's most hated episode, Charades. In terms of how I think this video holds up, I would say my current views are much more closer to aesthetic subjectivism, but I think I made some good points like Muffin as an allegory for children with special needs, or an emphasis on the character dynamics. There was this one part where I tried to justify the pacing and amount of time spent on different things, and I just recorded the timestamps for various events throughout the story. But overall, it's still one of my better videos, and more importantly, it did well. So, today we will be doing a book review, maybe some other shit too, because this probably won't take 10 minutes. In terms of Bluey books as a whole, there is some controversy due to them being generally poorly made and just slideshow retellings of the episodes, which is partly what I want to see about. I know these adaptation books generally have a reception of being cheaply made and commercialised rather than original expressions of artistic desire, and there's also this bigger issue of art and capitalism and the system in general, which in an ideal world would have been addressed yesterday, but let's say I'm less confident in condemning this specific book and take a look at it. I'm not going to read it to you, you're not 5. One thing I immediately noticed is that without the medium of a TV show, some of the logistics can be confused in the original scene. I think Nana was tending to the parents by the door here, but it makes this one still image look a bit weird as the kids who are arriving stand in the centre of the room and Nana is standing by the door despite everyone seemingly all being in. But also, introducing a new framing device can be good for some aspects. For instance, this image. Closing it in makes the characters feel closer and draws more attention to details such as Muffin holding the ice block for socks. It's honestly impressive how much character the Bluey team was able to put into just this one shot, the way these different characters sit and eat and how that reflects their dynamics. This also is possibly the first instance of my proposed theme in which Muffin holding the ice block for socks maybe shows her working around and supporting Socks' needs. It makes Muffin feel less of an object to get the theme across and more actively involved in the theme and learning from it. These details were mostly still present in the original, but it's very easy for them to go unseen, and that's kind of the point of these books. They make the medium slower and more calming or personal. I think the dialogue and character motions were portrayed as well as they could have been here. They don't feel like afterthoughts that only exist to support the pictures and the graphics. I'd say here does a really good job of applying an aesthetic, the calmer emotion where you were permitted to notice these smaller movements. A thing I'd like to note is that in the original episode, and for I think the entire show, Muffin has a slight speech impediment, where she can't pronounce R sounds.
I don't want a frog card. I want the ballerina card.
Which is sort of lost in translation here, but it also maybe had to be. In this environment where everything is made more intentional and tangible, the specific decision to spell out Muffin's speech impediment in the textual conversation could come across as jarring and maybe a smidge ableist. I'm genuinely not sure. I think the decision to type out her dialogue as that of all of the others makes sense, and it was the right choice for this story, even if it loses some of the nuance of the original. However, I can see counter-arguments for this, such as how it also might take away from some context, like Muffin possibly being this allegory. I'd love to know your thoughts. Make sure to comment them along with your full legal name and address, your phone and credit card number, and all of your credentials. Oh, here's an interesting inconsistency between the pages. On this page, Bluey is collecting a card, this weird fish thing, and this text quip is shown by it. I'd imagine as a representation of her thoughts or some communication with the audience, because if Bluey actually said this, all of the other characters would have known what her card had said. However, these same text graphics are used on the next page to display the family's guesses as to what Bluey is representing, like a bush or Isis. Obviously here, these aren't just thoughts in the characters' heads, and they also probably have a somewhat different emotion. I say this, but it all still kind of makes sense. You intuitively understand the difference between these two instances of the text. Do I think some distinction should have been made? Namely, designating one of these two instances into the cluster of dialogue at the top? Well, no. I think it's kind of a fun conversation between you and the artwork through this clearly unintentional wound it's displaying. The graphic designs are really displayed on this next page spread, and I think I'll take this time to touch on how they're used over the entire text, to avoid this becoming yet another excruciating play-by-play of works whose conversation mostly comes from an aesthetic in this channel. So the graphics in this book obviously make use of shapes and colours to convey ideas and emotions, like a red spiky background to indicate conflict or yellow circular backgrounds to draw attention to certain aspects. But in addition to that, they produce a greater aesthetic idea. I'd identify 3 key aspects of this. For one, it's a very cosy atmosphere. The colours are gentle yet emotional pastels, and the shapes are mostly supporting elements in the background. Secondly, it draws attention to its medium as a piece of art, to its slow and artistic nature. You're immediately aware of how some force is writing over this story, translating it especially for you and holding a dialogue with you. This taps into the third idea of how it interrupts and interacts with the linear understanding of time. All of this serves to add to a sense of greater emotional connection and an entirely new dynamic with the story. Honestly, maybe a bit better for what they intended with the original artwork. It could even have some impacts on the theming. This sort of changes how you associate with the work from a more physical reality to an emotional connection and understanding. I think it really works well, especially for my reading. Obviously, in a book, tone might not come across as well, like on this spread particularly, every line ends with an exclamation mark when they sort of represent different emotions. One is enthusiasm and the other is clarity, but they make it feel a lot more mean-spirited in general, though it can also be charming, like how a child might not be especially good at communicating different emotions. Also, they have this page dedicated to Sock's emotions, something that's present, if a bit sidelined, in the original episode, and left for the viewer to deduce through background details. In this book, that's both kind of harder and easier to pull off. Harder in that there's less nuance between the pages, but also, as we've discussed, it can bring an identity to individual moments. It asks you to interrogate each page more closely. I kind of would have preferred if it were expressed only in the background, like the ice block imagery, if they really called on the full potential of this medium to be explored here as its independent identity. Though I also understand that this is a more important part of the story that a younger demographic of readers would need to understand to make a value judgment of it and its themes. I can see why this would be deemed the right decision, I'd probably even agree with it, but there is this interesting conflict of what background ideas get canonised, and I'm not even saying that some getting canonised and some not is a bad thing. I like poking around for these hidden little details that feel like they were out here just for me to discover. I like being able to pry more thematic depth and arrive at observations. It's just another one of the strange consequences that come from adapting this into a book. Another thing here, having these large expanses of detailed show backgrounds look out of place, especially in contrast to the calming mosaics of the last pages. It feels jarring and imposing, and that isn't what the background originally felt like in the episode due to a lack of contrast. It's a more distracting image, though that could be the point. A lot of these graphic designs and their emergent aesthetic could mimic a greater emphasis on the sensory and physical nature of the environment in the story, which of course would tap into my headcanoning of Muffin as an ADHD representation, and maybe that story inherently works better in a book, though that could be the intention for this point in the story. Now, in the original video, I mentioned one of the criticisms for the Charades episode of Bluey being that Muffin's characterization and actions are annoying, that the shouting at and imposing over others and the story is grating and distracting from the overall narrative, and I would say that that reading is entirely justified. Maybe this book is a better piece of art in that way. The emphasis is put on the story and surroundings rather than Muffin. Her demands are now scrawlings of text, indistinguishable from all of the others, and more of the focus can be designated to the other characters and actions in the storybook format. I, for one, call this cowardice. Not only does the TV approach make it more realistic and helpful, which isn't much of a counterpoint to it being genuinely displeasurable, but I think that if we are granted this sensory depth, then it justifies a reciprocal payoff of those senses. It feels like a natural unravelling of the setup and all comes across as elegant. Obviously neither view is right, but the path taken in this episode is more to my taste and emotions from growing up autistic and viewing sensory environments from a similar perspective. Are those emotions kind of based on something resembling spite? Sure, but they're still tangible. This book makes it feel like a key part of why I enjoyed the originals being watered down. Now, like I said, the book highlights and even elevates other elements of the theming very well. I'd probably even call it a better work of art overall. These changes just read as the necessary counterpoint to converting the episode to this medium and aesthetic. Anyway, we're about halfway through the book now, and I've said most of what I want to say, and I'm also worried about the structuring of this video. There are still interesting observations about the translation to this medium and some payoffs to it, but I want to wrap this up and leave on these key ideas. I do, however, want to return to the initial question of whether this book is poorly made, disingenuous even. And to that I'd say, sure. It probably doesn't represent that much of Bluey's workforce, and is on the lower end in terms of effort, but that also doesn't define the quality of an artwork, nor does effort's symptoms. Art made quickly, even without passion or professional equipment, has the capacity to be just as good as art made by professionals and with more time and money investments. especially since all of this is subjective. I don't think I lied or hyperbolized any of my points in this video. I genuinely think this book is a surprisingly good artwork when analysed, and when you have all of my tastes and presuppositions. It's definitely very interesting, and hey, maybe low effort artwork isn't really the largest issue with Bluey and other IPs, especially if the recent claims at Lodu Studios' working conditions are to be believed. Of course, I can't guarantee there weren't similar issues with the production of these books. The products aren't very distant, and I don't want to imply anyone's the villain for liking art with more complexity or effort, or for not liking this book and similar ones. If you had any different readings or likes and dislikes about this book, then just feel free to share them. But remember, these books can't be bad, but they can be bad. The real issue isn't bad art, it's capitalism, as it usually is. I think a lot of the sentiment in this discourse isn't even really that the books are bad, but more that they're kind of dishonest. People buy them under the pretense of them being more thorough or original or a higher degree of effort and feel ripped off by the final product, which is entirely valid, and I would posit that more effort should have been placed in representing these books accurately. This is me from a terrible future where I don't have access to a microphone. I figured I'd elaborate on what the fuck I meant by this. Usually studios don't like advertising the fact that their books are poorly written or often actively difficult to follow, and those things are also kind of vague and subjective to an extent. I was going to recommend that they upload 3 or 4 readings of these books to a publicly available site like YouTube or even in Disney Plus like they sometimes do with extra content. It was only while editing this video and trying to find some high quality images of the pages that I realised that they already do that. With all of the books, in fact. This, in and of itself, is really good. Like, the broadest possible solution is for these books to just be free, and now they are. But of course, Bluey wouldn't want such an easy and legal way of not paying for their art so out in the open, and I can't really blame them. But that means that in most cases where you might find these books in shops or on online sites, you would have no way of knowing that these versions exist. I think a fine solution would be to have a handful of book readings or maybe shorter preview readings online and give each book a QR code for its reading or a playlist. And though there's no real solution for independent online sites, the pages on the Bluey websites could also link these videos like they do with the clips of the episodes. Now that's a big W. This is absolutely not a perfect solution. For one, these video readings serve to help with the books being more accessible, so having them not available in that format would be bad and vaguely discriminatory, but having them be more visible would lose out on potential sales, which is what we're trying to minimise in this hypothetical. I felt kind of surprised too when I realised how few pages the book had. These things could have been advertised better, and for the record, I think the show's storytelling gave a lot of people a false impression of what these books would be like, which is a harder question of how to solve, but still not a great thing. But being short or unoriginal isn't an inherent flaw, or virtue for that matter, with the artwork. It doesn't owe you being anything else. This goes for most criticisms of the books. Less emotion, a contrived plot, and awkward dialogue, like I described, can either make these books better or worse. I would like to bring this video full circle and talk about one final criticism of these books that I think deserves its own section, and that is the idea that these books rely on the audience's prior knowledge. And my opinion on this is that it's more capitalism bullshit. Like, the artwork might want an original identity from the episode of the show, but putting the ability to analyse or even understand key elements of the book behind a paywall of another show, especially one with history of censorship, seemingly incoherent discrepancies in broadcasting, and paywalling as rocky as Bluey's, doesn't seem like a great idea. Even families who weren't in Australia had to wait months for a ton of Season 3 because Disney is just a piece of shit company, which is a bit of a downer. I guess if there is one thing to take away from this video, it's that art isn't really responsible for how you eventually see it, but it is responsible for how it's advertised and how accessible it is. Maybe, hopefully, this revelation will change how I interact with my own art and hopefully not take about a year to make the next video. Okay, bye, love you.